Good morning and welcome to The Point. As we continue to talk to candidates for office in 2018, this morning, another candidate for Attorney General. It's Speaker of the House, Tom Leonard, a Republican who has another year as Speaker, but he talks to us about why he wants to be the next Attorney General. Tell me why you decided to run for Attorney General.
Well, first, I love fighting for people. I have done this my entire professional career. I was a prosecutor for 3 years in Genesee County, specifically in the city of Flint. I spent 2 years in the Attorney General's office, and this is a passion of mine. It has been a passion of mine to be in law enforcement for some time, ever since I was a prosecutor for Genesee County.
When you look at the job of Attorney General, it's a lot of different things. I mean, it takes in a very big scope. How do you break that down? What do you see as the most important function of that office?
Well, definitely the protection of our people, especially those that are most vulnerable, the mentally handicapped, our elderly, and those that are physically handicapped. The protection of our people, to me, is the number one duty of our Attorney General.
When the Attorney General is representing the state of Michigan, sometimes they represent the state entity, but sometimes they at the same time represent the people of the state. So you can be involved in a case in a lot of different aspects of it. I'm not sure how to ask the question. How encompassing is it? Because it seems to me it could get a little bit confusing because you have a lot of different people to advocate for.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Attorney General has a constitutional duty to represent the departments of our state. So sometimes there's situations where the Attorney General has to defend one of our departments, even if he or she does not want to. And if they don't, at times they can set up a conflict wall where they have to defend the State Department, but the Attorney General can take an opposite position.
So when the Attorney General, for example, makes a decision to go after a particular issue, it could be either driven by law here in the state of Michigan, you could be pursuing the bad guys, or you could be, like happens from time to time, you could join with other attorneys general perhaps to object to something that's happening on the federal level.
Oh, for instance, I mean, well, let's take, I was in the Attorney General's office. I represented the Department of Corrections. And more often than not, our corrections officers, they are hardworking, they are great people, but once in a while you would have one that would do something out of line, and we still had to defend that individual. So again, the Attorney General has a constitutional duty to represent the departments of this great state.
What does it mean from your perspective to have the Attorney General's office be, in your case, in the hands of a Republican, as it has been for the past 7 years? Previous to that, there were another 8 years with Mike Cox, if my math serves right. How much does politics play into it?
Well, for me, it's not a matter of R versus D. It's a matter of having somebody that can get the job done. And again, when you look at my past experience, I've been there. I was in law enforcement. I was a prosecutor for 3 years. I was a drug prosecutor. Not only was I there in the courtroom convicting or going after the bad guys, but there were times I'd have to go out on the streets with the officers. They'd have to put a dirty hoodie sweatshirt on. I'd have to put a bulletproof vest. I'd have to be with them as they were executing search warrants to ensure that everything they were doing was within the letter of the law and our Constitution. So to me, it's making certain that we've got the right person with the right experience that's there in that office.
You've mentioned a couple of times drugs and the criminal element. How big of a problem do you perceive exist in our state? Because we hear about it all the time being here in the newsroom. We know that we've gone from methamphetamines to the opioid problem, and we know that it's getting a lot of attention, but we don't know if it's getting any solutions. How big a problem is that?
It's a huge problem. In fact, when I was a drug prosecutor 10 years ago, very seldom did you hear the term opioids. As you said, everything was methamphetamine, it was crack cocaine, it was heroin. And to see how this opioid epidemic has taken over our state and our nation, for that matter. I mean, in 2015, we lost 2,000 of our citizens. I mean, think about that. In 2001, we lost 3,000 during September 11th. We lost 2,000 of our citizens just here in Michigan in 2015 because of this opioid epidemic. It's certainly huge, and it's something that Bill Schuette has done a great job bringing awareness. He has done a great job fighting and combating this, but our next Attorney General has to step it up even a notch further. We've got to continue to battle this epidemic.
And what kind of an approach is that? Because on one hand, you've got the people on the street. As you say, as a prosecutor, you were out there. I suspect as the Attorney General, they would not let you go out on the street necessarily. But the point is, you've got the folks on the front line, which are local law enforcement, the local police, the county sheriff's office, MSP, but then you come through on the prosecution side depending on how big that case is if it's not handled locally.
Yeah, well, it's ensuring that we have compassion on those who may have become addicted of no fault of their own, but making certain that we have a jail cell for those that are actually dealing these drugs, those that are the bad actors. If we have doctors that are abusing this, if we have people on the streets that are abusing this, we need to come down on them as hard as we can. But again, as a drug prosecutor, I have seen there are certain individuals that get addicted to drugs at times, and it's of no fault of their own. So we need to make certain that we have compassion on those individuals as well.
That's part of the criminal part of the job, but there's a lot more to it. We know that Frank Kelly often talked about consumer protection through the Attorney General's office, and if I think I have a company that hasn't dealt with me fairly, you would be perhaps my last resource as an Attorney General. How big a job is that in that department?
Oh, it's big. I mean, the Attorney General is the people's advocate. The Attorney General is a voice for the people. If somebody's been wronged by a large corporation, the Attorney General is the last resort. In fact, when I was in college, I had a situation with a computer company, and I actually had to contact the Attorney General's office, and they were my voice. They helped me through that process. So certainly, the Attorney General is very instrumental when it comes to consumer protection.
Talk to me about being Speaker and how that experience gives you a better insight into government as a whole, because I think sometimes until you're there, it's a little hard to see how this big group of departments, I mean, just the funding alone, which you become very familiar with from doing the budget process. How does that play into your potential campaign?
Well, navigating the process is certainly important. I mean, for instance, if as the next Attorney General, I would like to see us set up an elder abuse task force. We had one in Genesee County. This is rampant across our state and across the nation, and it's going to require a lot of good legislation. It's going to require extra funding to really implement this. With me having been Speaker, with the relationships that I have in Lansing, with the relationships that I have with many of the legislators, I know how the process works. I'm somebody that can go there and I can get that done.
And without getting too far in the weeds, but when you said it's going to need more funding, you also know how difficult it is to get funding and how little wiggle room there is in that budget.
Oh, absolutely. It is tough.
So, but you think that's something that can be done?
Certainly, this is something that can be done. Again, when I look at, again, this idea of setting up an elder abuse task force, something we had in Genesee County, it was very successful. We had investigators, we had prosecutors that got up every day, and their top initiative was to snuff out and prosecute crimes against our elderly. And this is something that we need to do in the Attorney General's office as well.
It dawns on me that one of the things that you have promoted since becoming Speaker is you wanted to deal with mental health issues. And as Attorney General, no doubt some, and I won't quantify how much, but some, particularly over on the criminal element that you talk about, would be tied back to mental health issues. So some of that is somewhat circular.
Yeah, this is this mental health system that we have, I call it our broken mental health system. This is something we need to address, and I have done that diligently as Speaker of the House. Right now, we spend $2 billion per year on our corrections budget at an average cost of $38,000 per inmate. But what a lot of people don't know is this. About a quarter of our prison population suffers from some type of mental illness, and when they do, those costs are about $110,000 per year. Now, we have done a great job implementing and expanding mental health courts here in the state of Michigan, but I have traveled the state, I've spoken to our prosecutors, and I know many of the prosecutors in urban areas, they simply don't have the resources to get bodies into those mental health courts. And even in the rural areas, when they only have 1 or 2 prosecutors, it's very difficult for them to implement these mental health courts. That's another thing I'd like to do as the next Attorney General, ensuring that we are collaborating with our local prosecutors and we are getting prosecutors and assistant AGs into these mental health courts to ensure we're helping those in need.
One of the other areas that we have heard a good deal of conversation about, obviously we know about what this current Attorney General is doing in regard to Flint, But I want to talk about environment more broadly, because we know we've heard a lot about the pipeline up in the Straits. We know that there have already been oil spills here, and we know about the contamination in Flint. How much environmental work is there to do in the Attorney General's office?
Well, it is absolutely vital that we protect our precious natural resources. And here in Michigan, as you know, Rick, we have no precious resource that is more valuable than our Great Lakes. Now, in regards to Line 5, a lot of folks would like to take just a knee-jerk reaction and say, shut it down now. And I believe there's no doubt we have to find a way to shut this down. However, we need to make certain that when we do this, we're not putting thousands of our residents in the Upper Peninsula in a situation where they can no longer heat their homes. Right now, we employ, I think we're the 11th highest employed state as it relates to natural gas. We can't put thousands of people out of work. So this has to be well thought out. We can't just have some knee-jerk political reaction where we say, shut it down now. We have to look after all of our citizens, particularly those in the Upper Peninsula that need to heat their homes this winter.
On the other hand, the longer it's there, if there is a problem, and I don't presuppose anything about it, but if there is a problem, then the danger exists.
Right, and I have little doubt that there is some type of problem. I mean, I have been very disappointed with the response coming out from Enbridge and some of the things that we have seen over the past several weeks. But again, when we do this, we have to do it in a way to ensure that we don't have thousands of residents in the Upper Peninsula that can't heat their homes. That would not be right.
As we've told you before, the Attorney General's position isn't one that you will vote on during the August primary. That's a decision made by the Republican or Democratic parties at their conventions, and we'll continue to follow the progress of all of the candidates and be back with more To the Point. Welcome back to the Point in Lansing. At any given time, there is always a lot of legislation that's being considered, and it's not always stuff that you hear about because not every single bill gets reported on. That's why from time to time, we try to seek out representatives to find out what's on their mind. That's what we did this past week with Democratic Representative Brian Elder from Bay City. Representative, in a body of 110, you deal with a lot of different issues, and sometimes they aren't all at the forefront. For example, we've heard a lot of conversation about auto no-fault insurance, but you have other issues that you're interested in. One of them has to do with partial way that schools are funded. Talk to me a little bit about that funding source and what your concerns are.
Okay. Right now in the state of Michigan, there are 6 ISDs, which are usually run at the county level, that have what are called enhancement millages. Now, these are millages that the voters have voted on to give their local public schools a little bit extra money. And those monies are primarily for operational costs. So that might be upgrading technology. It might be hiring additional teachers to make sure that class size stays low. It might be bricks and mortar type issues to deal with infrastructure. So right now there is a proposal that comes from the state Senate to allow charter schools to tap into those funds. And that's problematic for a number of reasons. First of all, when we opened the door to our charter school regime, the charter school industry promised that they would never seek these types of monies, that they were free market based and they didn't need any additional money and they could compete just fine. Well, what we've found is that over the last 15 years, there's probably an additional 250 or more charter schools in the state of Michigan. 80% of those are private, for-profit corporations. Oftentimes the corporations are not from here in Michigan, and they're running their schools for a profit line. Okay. The problem is that we have not increased the pie for public education in the state of Michigan. Instead, we've just added 250 more people to the dinner table. So the public schools are having some problems, but the charter schools are having problems also. And they're not doing too well, and that's why they're trying to chase down this additional money. One of the problems that really bothers me is we have a lot of cyber schools in the state of Michigan, and enhancement money, if it's intended to reduce class size, well, that's not relevant to a cyber school. That's not a problem they have. And if the money is intended for technological upgrades, to make sure that the rooms are Wi-Fi connected, or if the plumbing needs to be fixed, or the ceilings have a problem. None of those issues are relevant to cyber schools, but they would be able to tap into these funds also. And I think that it's wrong.
When you think about charter schools, I mean, there are charter schools that operate within a school district. Sometimes they have some connection to,
Sometimes.
and sometimes they are in addition to, or a specialty school and that type of thing. And not speaking to cyber schools, because that's a little bit different, but
Right.
they do have brick and mortar issues, and they do have classrooms and all of those kind of things. But you still believe that this particular funding source for those ISDs who have gone out and convinced the folks to vote for that enhancement, that those should be only for traditional public schools.
That's exactly right. The problem is we're not going to increase the amount of money available in these enhancement millages. So every single dollar that is transferred to a charter school, which had promised not to ask for this money, is necessarily a dollar that's not going to go to the public school. And that means you have another year where they can't get the class size down in first grade. It's another year where they're going to have to deal with some ceiling tiles that have problems. Another year where the technology is going to be outdated. And that's not what the voters in these areas requested.
Still, and not to belabor the point, those students that are going to charter schools are still taxpayers' children, right?
Oh, undoubtedly. And their parents made decisions that, for their own personal reasons, that they wanted to take their kids and put them in a for-profit school. And they're free to make that choice. But once you make that choice, it comes with some consequences, one of which is this funding source is not available to you, and it was never available to you.
When you look at charter schools overall and look at the impact that they've had, and I know education, given your background as an attorney, we were talking just earlier, so you understand the importance of that education system. How are we doing there when you say we haven't expanded the pie for these districts, but inviting more people to the table? What has the development of charter schools done to our educational system and to our funding?
The charter school regime that we have in the state of Michigan is unique nationwide. It's almost like the wild, wild west. Almost anybody can get certified. There's almost no transparency in how these schools are operated, and it has been a definite detriment to the traditional public school system. And when you have a charter school, you can have a good charter school operator. They can be doing a good job. But if someone sets up a franchise across the street, suddenly they can be competing with another school that doesn't have any kind of accountability, can maybe cherry pick their kids, and you have this cycle, this rush to the bottom. And it has had a very serious negative impact on how we do things in the state of Michigan, especially because we've had such a spike in the number of charter schools, and we have not increased the amount of public school funding over the last 15 years.
What is, if that is the problem from your perspective, what is the answer to that?
Well, I think the promise that was made originally is that these charter schools would operate like public schools, but have a different business model. So if they're taxpayer funded, then they should have to do all of the things that a public school does. They should be covered more strongly under the Open Meetings Act, so citizens can go and see how things are actually operated. We should have access to all of their documents and records under the Freedom of Information Act in the same way that you do in a public school. And that way the average citizen can hold these schools accountable. And when they do that, some charter schools will be stars. They'll be good operations. But then the bad apples, they'll be scurrying in the sunlight.
I want to change the subject a little bit. Recently, Democrats have started talking about, I think it's a pretty big package of legislation that would, they believe, stop what they call wage theft. First of all, what is wage theft?
Wage theft can take a number of aspects. Probably the most common is when employees in the food service industry have their tips held back from them by employers. or if they're forced to work past their shift but they're not paid overtime, and in some places where they're simply forced to work off the clock. And the employees in this sector are predominantly women, and they're predominantly poor. And these are non-unionized workforces, so these employees are easy to take advantage of if the employer is a bad actor. And the unfortunate thing is most employers are not this way, but the bad actors, they get this unfair advantage when they steal workers' money. And if you have a good local restaurant right down on Main Street and they're doing everything the right way, they shouldn't have to compete with these bad actors. And what happens to the employees? Well, these are people who are doing everything the right way, right? We want them to work, and they're working. And they're trying to take care of things on their own, and they're not asking for handouts. And then if they happen to be stuck in a situation where they need a job, how do they defend themselves against a bad employer? I think the only way to address this issue, and it's a rampant problem, is to make sure there are laws in place that stop the bad actors. And so that's why we've introduced a series of bills that have very serious consequences for any of these bad employers. You can actually face jail time if you've stolen enough money. You can have fines up to $10,000. And I think with those kinds of problems or those kinds of solutions in place, then those bad actors are going to stop acting bad. And then people who are doing the right thing, trying to take care of themselves, trying to provide for their families, they're going to be protected.
There'll be people sitting at home this morning watching this that'll say, well, why wouldn't they just walk away? But the fact is that some of these folks you talk about can't afford to walk away from that particular job, and that's how these employers can take advantage of it.
That's exactly right. So if you've got a single working mother, maybe this is the job she has because it fits her calendar during the day, and she's getting her kids to school, and she's got to be home when they get home from school, and she's doing everything that we would want a mom to do, and she's only got a certain amount of time where she can work. Well, if she's especially in a small town, there might not be a lot of other places for her to work, and it's wrong to take advantage of somebody in that situation.
And it could be a transportation issue. It might be nearby, and there might not be adequate transportation. So these measures, and we won't go through all of them because there are a number of them, but as you say, they come with some pretty stringent penalties that go along with them. And I know it was your caucus, your fellow caucus members that introduced them. Have you gotten any feedback from the majority side of the aisle?
Not yet, but I'll tell you this. One of the things that people believe is that the two parties are always fighting with each other, and that's not really the case. Many of us have very good relationships across the aisle, and there are good folks in the Republican caucus who also think it would be wrong to take advantage of a working mother. So we're hoping to have hearings on these bills, and we're hoping to pass them into legislation.
The bill that Representative Elder talked about that would change where some of the education money goes was on the schedule for this past week in Lansing, but it was removed. We don't know when or if it will come back up, but it's something we'll continue to watch. And we'll be back with more To the Point. Finally this morning, a note about concealed carry laws here in the state of Michigan. The Senate has passed out a new set of bills that would change where and how you could carry, including churches and schools, even bars. They've passed the Senate, but don't expect them to be taken up anytime soon in the House. There's still a lot of conversation, and those bills will not be the final word. That is our final word. We'll see you next week. To the Point.